Welcome to the program. Vladimir Putin was inaugurated for his fourth term as Russia's president for 6 more years in office. But this new term comes on the background of growing opposition in the country and Western sanctions hitting hard on Putin's close circle. Now, what can Ukraine and the world expect from this term? Joining us in the studio for an overview of this situation is foreign policy and security expert Oleksandr Khara. Thank you for joining us.
Hello.
So, first, Russian President Vladimir Putin officially took office on May 7th. He is 65 now and obviously can't go on forever. Some foreign observers says this term could and would be focused on grooming his successor. Do you think it might influence Russia's policy over Ukraine?
Well, I believe that the song will remain the same. In general, Putin believes that all this legacy, his legacy beginning from the 2000, is showing that he is right in a lot of direction. And even though Russia is in the international isolation, in perils, in economic trouble as well, and certainly there are some signals that there is civil unrest in Russia, but he believes in the long run he can win, and certainly he needs to secure his line of foreign and domestic policy. That's why I don't think that he is going to change anything except of the rhetorics. In his inaugural speech, he was talking about and appealing to the Russians, partially because there was no any foreign representative at his inauguration ceremony. The Western leaders just ignored this farce, actually. Secondly, the Russians are pretty sure that he delivered them greatness. But now they expect something in return for their hardship, for their losses in economical life and other. So he was showing a willingness to put focus on the domestic issues. And actually he repeats himself, because in 2012 there were so-called May decrees, a lot of the decrees that he signed to boost the economic productivity, the well-being of ordinary Russians, and certainly he was not able to fulfill his promises. Now he is pushing a new agenda, and he signed the ambitious strategy of economic development, fighting the poverty. In fact, 22 million of Russians live below the line of poverty, which is pretty huge number given the riches that the Russian land has. So I don't believe that he is capable of changing anything, and I don't believe that he is going to grow any kind of heir to his throne, because he has done a lot of misdeeds and a lot of crimes actually to his own people, beginning from the Chechen nation and other Northern Caucasian nation, and certainly Russians. And he has done a lot of things that qualified him as an international criminal, because of the Syrian war, because what he has done in Donbass and certainly in Crimea as well. So that's why there is no place and there is no person who can guarantee him security and his freedom and enjoyment of his riches he accumulated unofficially during all this reign in Russia. That's why I don't believe he's going to try to find a figure who would replace him in the future.
Now, what about opposition? Recently, we saw protests in St. Petersburg, in Moscow, led by Mr. Navalny against Putin's inauguration. What's your view on the opposition today?
Well, firstly, it's good that the Western governments, and especially the government of the United States, heavily criticized what has been on the streets, and I mean the suppression, and especially those video streamings when we see how the teenagers were arrested and put into the police cars, which is absolutely unacceptable. By the way, according to the Russian constitution, each citizen and certainly gathering of citizens is allowed to have a protest or any kind of manifestations. And it's the president who is supposed to guard these rights. And certainly in case of Putin, he is suppressing these rights. So it's good that I mean, Ukraine and the West criticize Putin for what he has done. At the same time, I see no real potential of the opposition in Russia. They are trying trying to avoid this connection of the events, and they don't want to be called the people who are on Maidan. They don't want to have a revolution. But in Russian realities, it's impossible to shift the power, to change the power in democratic way, because we've seen the changes to the constitution. I mean, the term of the cadency, the term in office. Secondly, the head of the constitutional court is the notorious person who once said that slavery was a pretty good thing to connect the Russian people during the imperial times. So if we have such a person in charge of the most important institution of the court branch, so what should we expect from others? So I don't believe that opposition is the force that can change something. The line where the most weak point of this power, or the power of Putin, lies in regions. Regions are not happy with the over-concentrated power in Moscow. They are not happy with all these sanctions and counter-sanctions that are draining Russian economy, that are not enabling the businesses to develop, and certainly for the well-being of the Russian citizens to have a place. So that's why we should focus our attention to the Caucasian region. Each area, the Chechen Republic and Dagestan and other republics, and then to Tatarstan, and then to the Far East, because people over there are not happy with all this greatness that Putin brought with misery in economic terms.
Yeah, because these are regions often forgotten by Western media in that case, that they don't seem important into the analysis in Western media. How do you explain that? How do you explain this grey zone here?
Well, the Western observers and politicians are much Western-oriented in terms of the thinking, political thinking, and the same mistake they've done towards Ukraine. Because they believe in state, and state is something that is made up not just by civil servants, but politicians who are elected. And those politicians represent the will of the people, of their constituencies. It's not the case with Russia. So the state is something different to the nation. Even though a majority of Russians support the Putin's agenda, and especially foreign policy agenda, they are proud of the annexation, illegal annexation of Crimea. 86% of the Russians believe that it was the right thing to do, even though it was against the Russian constitution, Ukrainian constitution, our bilateral agreements, and UN Charter. They believe it was the right thing to do. So that's why the Western observers believe that there is a state and there is a connection between constituencies of people. It's not the case in Russia. To some extent, it's not the case in Ukraine. That's why there should be much more attention to the civil society, non-governmental organization, in those who are not dependent on the budget. And that's why they can be independent from the authorities in Moscow.
Now, so there is, as you said, there might be pressure from the region and from inside the country. But now let's talk about external pressure. There's regularly new round of sanctions against Russia. Recently, the last round of sanctions hit Mr. Deripaska hard because he lost like 50% of his fortune in one day, which is huge. Do you see it working? Do you see that there is progress in that efforts, that Russia might at one point listen to Western countries in that case?
Well, if we're talking about the war against Ukraine that Russia is waging, and certainly sanctions related to it, there are three cases where Russia can stop this aggression. First case, if we capitulate, if Ukraine agrees to limit our sovereignty, not to become a member of the NATO or the European Union. In this case, there is no need for Putin to continue his war against Ukrainian nation. Second case, it's that the price of this aggression is skyrocketing and there is no reason to continue. And third case, if there is no resources for his aggressive foreign policy. And certainly sanctions, the Western sanctions, and especially European ones, are serving both these causes, undermining his financial position in the long run, And secondly, showing that there is a high price for his, as he called, independent foreign policy. How can we assess $250 billion that has been taken out of Russian economy in 4 years? I mean, the foreign direct investment that has been taken away by the investors. How would we define the drop in the military expenditure to $66 billion? Yes, Russia is on the fifth place of the biggest countries who spent their money on defense, but it's on decline. The same thing with technology. Certainly, there is a general let's say, conditions of the energy markets, and fortunately, almost accidentally with the conflict with Ukraine, there was a decrease in prices of gas and oil, the major source of income for Russia. But at the same time, there are other technologies are being produced, and especially so-called alternative energy sources, and Russia is not developing them enough. So they depended on the raw materials and energy sources, and in the future, in the nearest future, those sources will be not that important, and that's why even those limited sanctions to the energy sector, not allowing them to exploit new fields in the Western Siberia or the shelf of the Arctics. And it means that even in traditional energy, they are going to lose those positions in the global markets. So sanctions are working. They are undermining his position. They are hurting the internal circle. But the most important thing, they are showing that there is limit of Russia. Russia is so dependent on the Western money, Western financial system to get profit out of this money made of oil and gas. They are so dependent on the Western expertise, how to invest this money smartly. They are so dependent on the Western technologies. 1.6% of the total necessity of the machinery and precise equipment in Russia was covered by the Russian production. So even all those machinery needed to produce military equipment and the ones in the space industry or oil and gas industry are coming from the West.
So you're saying that despite this speech of isolationism and country pride and all that kind of aggressive rhetoric, Russia is entirely and mostly dependent of the West.
Yes, it's so dependent on the West, and especially on European money markets and the technology, that those sanctions that in place are really hurting him. And let's get back to the Cold War. During the Cold War, there was such a thing like a coordination committee. It was firstly informal, then formal secret meeting of the Western powers that was willing to limit the ability of the Soviet Union and its satellites to develop not just military technologies and the weaponry, but the civil as well.
Communication.
Yes,
yeah.
and we have almost the same thing. Russia is not producing semiconductors, and certainly it needs it for even for the civilian Sukhoi jet. Mm-hmm. Up to 70% of Sukhoi jet is the parts, and especially high-tech parts, I mean navigation and other stuff, communication units, are coming from the West. So even in the civil sphere, they cannot do this. Let's have a look at the space. They are not able to produce enough satellites to cover the world with their positioning system, analog of the GPS, and certainly it undermines the ability to strike, to make precise strikes by their military. The same thing with launching rockets. So the same thing with producing new cars and so on. By the way, Putin was delivered to his inaugural speech by the car made in Russia.
Yeah, but we saw the limo, the famous limo.
But it's a copycat from Phantom, Rolls-Royce Phantom. So Russia, as its predecessor, Soviet Union, is stealing secrets, design, technology, but in contrary to Soviet Union, it doesn't have resources and manpower to produce on the same scale. So Russia is not in the same position, and that's why it's much weaker than the Soviet Union.
Well, thank you for this overview of the situation in Russia. It was a pleasure to have you in the studio.
Thank you for having me.
This was Oleksandr Khara. He's a foreign policy and security expert. Thank you for watching the program. Stay tuned for the rest.